It's my pleasure now to introduce today's presenter, José Rodriguez, who is also one of my very good friends. José has served students for nearly a decade, beginning as an academic advisor at the University of Miami's Department of Psychology before moving to Florida International University in 2005. José presented on communication-related topics at a number of NACADA annual and regional conferences. He won the Best of 4 region designation for a session entitled Breaking Bad News to Students, Delivery is the Key. And I had the opportunity to be in that session at that conference in Atlanta and can tell you it was an outstanding event. He went on to be a top draw with over 200 attendees with this presentation described by attendees perfect, enthusiastic, and very knowledgeable at the 2007 annual conference in Baltimore. And I'm excited to say that I feel strongly that José represents our new professional advisors growing into the field of academic advising and who will be and are the future of the National Academic Advising Association. So at this point, I'm going to turn you over to José and we'll get started. José?
Thank you very much, Charlie, for that. And thank you, Charlie. And let me begin by saying thank you for all the support that you've given me as my emerging leader mentor. You know, if it weren't for you back in 2005 when I first started, or 2004, I forget the year now, I may have never decided to really give that presentation for NACADA. And I also want to thank Lee Cunningham and the executive office for all of her support. As all of you who regularly listen to the webcast know, she's the producer, or as I said during the practice, the executive producer of the online broadcast and is working in the background today, keeping the slides changing and making sure that I'm on task. She does an amazing job of supporting the organization, and I am truly thankful to be a recipient of that support. I'd also like to thank the Webinar Advisory Board Chair, Karen Thurman, for her support and for the initial planting of the idea of this webinar in my head. And finally, I'd like to thank Marcia Miller for assisting with our Q&A and Gary Cunningham for providing the IT support. The former president of Notre Dame University, the Reverend Edward Malloy, said in his 1999 book, Amongst Reflections, quote, "A college degree is not a sign that one is a finished product, but an indication a person is prepared for life." I've used this quote in my email messages for the last 4 years, and I thought it had a nice ring to it. I also believe it is right on with what our purpose is in higher education. Academic advisors are at the forefront of helping students to make the most of their undergraduate education. We are helping, as Reverend Malloy says, to prepare our students for life. In preparing them for life, we have to help our students understand the meaning of their education. We have to help them to see themselves in the most accurate light possible. It is the responsibility of academic advisors to have significant conversations with our students, conversations that can change the way students see themselves and their education. So today we'll discuss 3 main points. First, we'll look at the science of communication, the specific behaviors and nuances that make up this thing that we call communication. Then we'll look at the art of communication, how to use communication acts to elicit responses from students. We'll borrow some ideas from the counseling field and see how we can apply them towards the world of advising. Last, we'll delve into the hard conversations that we need to be having with our students. We'll look at how advising can be transformational. That is, how can advising change the way in which students see themselves and their education? I teach a class in communication, specifically also business communication, and I usually start off with the discussion of the meaning of the word communication. Well, what do we mean by communication? Well, let's take a look at the root of the word, commune. It means to share or to make common. Therefore, communication isn't simply the transmission of information. Crack open any intro textbook to communication theory, and you'll find the transactional model of communication. It's the most widely accepted model of explaining how humans communicate with each other. That is, how do we create and share meaning? Let's take a quick review of the parts of this model. First, a speaker or source must encode a message. That is, he has to kind of put things in such a way that a listener will understand. The speaker has to translate his ideas and intentions into verbal and nonverbal symbols that a person can recognize and then decode. Second is the message itself. This is the content of what is said and how it is said. How something is said is also known as a meta message, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Third is the channel. This is the medium by which a message shall be transmitted. It could be visual, auditory, or both, an email, a voicemail, face-to-face, all those kinds of things. Oftentimes, it is confused with this larger idea of communication. For example, I really can't tell you how many times I've been to meetings where someone will say, well, what we need to do is communicate better with our students. And what the person really is trying to say is that we need to email our students more often, email that they probably won't read anyway. In most cases, channel selection is not the problem. Rather, we need to look at how a message is constructed in the first place and make sure that we're putting things in such a way that students will understand and will minimize the misinterpretation. Fourth is the listener or the receiver receives the message and must then decode it. She attempts to understand the message in a way that the speaker had intended. This is probably the most difficult part of the model. How can we ensure that a listener decode a message in exactly the way that the speaker encoded it? Well, we can't. But that's just the nature of human communication. There's always going to be some error. Now, noise permeates this entire model. That is, interference with the message, either its creation, the reception, or the transmission. It can occur at any time. Noise can be both external, a door slamming, a loud ruckus. I hope you can't hear the phone ringing here in my office, but I have no way of turning it off. Maybe an internal noise, daydreaming, thinking about something else, which I'm sure no one's doing right now. Last, there's a feedback loop between the source and the receiver. The speaker knows that the listener is, well, listening because of the verbal and nonverbal responses that are given. This makes the model transactional. It goes back and forth. I believe that this model will help us work better with our students. It's not enough to just simply say, we told you what to do or not to do. Communication is a process. It's a give and take, a back and forth. It never is truly over. It is continuous and ongoing. How we encode and decode the meaning of the messages that we send is a very important process. Okay, let's take a quick pop quiz. Let's just see if folks are paying attention. Right now, to see how we're communicating. Hopefully you can already see the questions on your screen. This is kind of just for fun, and we won't spend a whole lot of time on it. So those of you who are watching the broadcast as a group on your campus, we ask that the group facilitator, or whoever you've nominated to be the group facilitator, just request that you take a show of hands to report the majority answer. Look at that. You don't even have to reach a consensus, so we're not going to be here until 4 o'clock. All right, so here's the question. In the transactional model, the medium by which messages are communicated is known as A, a source, B, message, C, channel, D, receiver, or E, feedback. Just use your mouse to click on the correct answer and then hit the submit button, and we'll see how well we've communicated.
So, Jose, I've noticed a growth in the use of technology and all the forms of social networking to communicate with our students. How does this model that you've just described apply to those kinds of technologies?
Well, that's a very good question, Charlie. I mean, technology is simply the channel by which the message is transmitted. We need to think about how messages are constructed in the first place if we've selected a more appropriate channel to send it through. In the business communication class that I teach, I often use the example of having an argument over instant messaging or email. I've often asked my students, how often have you gotten into a fight with someone over text messages or over email? And with someone that you didn't really mean to get into a fight with. The other person just misinterpreted what you wrote. Well, the problem is that in this kind of communication, we're missing a key feature in decoding the message, and that's the voice. And we'll talk more about this in just a moment. I guess we're almost ready to look at our results. Got 85%. Oh, okay. I guess we have our results here published, and wow, all right. So 95% of you are indeed listening. There are 3 persons who I believe are maybe have some internal noise, so it's okay. But you passed my class, so there you go. All right. next item here, we're going to talk. Oh, I just mentioned this idea of voice. Let's talk a little bit more about this. I'd like to briefly review 3 important factors or codes that affect how the meaning of a message is created. The language code is anything that is spoken or written. This generally refers to the words that you choose and the language that you speak. You know, English, Spanish, Mandarin. It also refers to the grammar and usage of words in a particular language. The vocal code is the way that we sound when we speak. This is also known as paralanguage, and I'm going to get into more detail about this momentarily. The final code is the visual code. It is what we look like when we speak. This is also known as nonverbal communication or body language. Again, we'll talk about this in more detail momentarily. When we communicate with each other, we are sending messages and meaning via these 3 codes. When there's a mismatch, when the words that one says don't match up with the sound of one's voice or the way one looks, people will tend to believe what is heard in the voice and what is seen in the body movements. For example, how do you know that someone's being sarcastic? They're saying things that seem absurd, but how do you know the person is just kidding? Something in the person's voice reveals the true meaning of what is said. Something in the way the person looks or the face given gives an indication as to what the person really means to say. So where is the real meaning of a message in communication? Well, it's in the voice and in the body language.
So, Jose, as an example of that, Karen Thurman just asked me for a recommendation of someone to work on another advisory board, and I sent her your name, and the board only has like 1 million things to do before next Tuesday. So you can expect a call from Karen, and I know you'll be glad to do that over this weekend.
Yeah, geez, Charlie. Thanks. You know, I might just have to quit my day job soon. So how did Charlie know I was just kidding? Well, he can't see me at the moment, so it wasn't the body language, but we could hear it in one another's voices. And we also entered the conversation with a strong foundational relationship based on a history of trust and respect. Because of that history and our familiarity with one another's vocal patterns, we can trade a barb and know it's in fun. And I know he really didn't mean that, right, Charlie? If I were seeing Charlie face to face, I would also throw in some, facial gestures just to let him know I was kidding. Maybe kind of smile as I said, geez, or, thanks and a wink. Of course, the opposite is true as well. As you well know, we just completed a rather intense presidential election in which a lot of things were said with a smile and a laugh that were really meant to be deep digs, a definite mismatch between the literal meaning of words that were spoken and the way they were intended to be understood. Let's discuss now this concept of paralanguage. What is it? Well, paralanguage is comprised of the various aspects of what we sound like when we say something. Earlier, I mentioned that the message is what is said, the words, and how it's said. I also mentioned this idea of meta-message, the meaning behind the meaning or the message behind the message. And as I just mentioned, how we sound can be even more important than what we actually say. That's that meta-message. Let's look at some of the particulars of paralanguage. Volume. Volume is how loud or soft we speak. It is literally that knob on a radio. There are some of us who, as Seinfeld once said, are low talkers. They speak very quietly, and it can be difficult to hear them. Changes in volume can indicate changes in temperament. When we get angry, we raise our voice. When you want to make a particular point, you usually say it louder. When I speak with my mother, it's usually pretty loud. And not because we're mad at each other, just, I don't know, I think she's hard of hearing these days. But anyways, pitch is the highness and lowness of tones. We typically don't speak like the guy from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You remember that guy, right? Bueller. There's usually some sort of a rise and a fall of our voice as we speak. A pitch inflection is where the rise and fall lands on a particular word. When we ask a question, we typically inflect the final word. When we make a statement, our pitch will tend to fall downward. Pitch inflection can drastically change the meaning of a sentence. The word over which we place the inflection will be stressed and therefore more meaningful or important. As you can see, I was trying to give you an example there. Rate is how fast or slow we speak. Now, some people speak really slow all of the time, and others speak so fast that you can hardly understand a word that was said. Pauses can be used to make emphasis. It allows the other person to think about what you said, or gives you a moment to think. Pauses can be either filled, as in, or unfilled, as in dead silence. Now, pausing too much can make it seem as if you don't know or understand what you're talking about. Not pausing enough may not allow the student time to think about what you've just said. We'll discuss pausing a little bit more when we discuss the art of communication. Emphasis is created when we combine the use of volume and pitch, inflection, rate, and pauses. In my lectures, when I try to emphasize a particular point, my volume raises. I make sure to think about the word that I want to inflect, and my rate slows down. Sometimes I pause for dramatic effect, or to make sure that the students understand what I just said. The final piece in understanding this science of communication is the concept of nonverbal communication, or body language. The study of nonverbal communication really began with Edward T. Hall, whose most famous book, The Silent Language, is truly a must-read. Let's look at some of the key aspects of nonverbal communication. Facial expressions and eye contact. It is often said that the eyes are the most expressive part of the face. They're the windows to the soul. They can communicate interest and attentiveness, as well as discomfort and dishonesty. Eye contact can be used to control the flow of communication and to signal whose turn it is to speak. In this picture taken last month at our annual conference in Chicago, you can see that I'm making eye contact with past Vice President Nancy Walburn, even though Charlie is at the moment the one communicating verbally. I was kind of trying to ignore Charlie, but I don't think he was getting that message. And in case you didn't hear it, I was just kidding. The use of eye contact is heavily dependent on culture. There are no universal rules for eye contact. In some cultures, it is very rude to stare at someone, especially of authority, when you're speaking. In other cultures, it is just rude not to stare. Gestures and body movements. There are 4 basic categories of gestures. The first is an emblem, and this is an exact verbal message, such as a thumbs up, or in some cases, expletives. The meaning of an emblem will vary from culture to culture. Sometimes I give the example of Romeo and Juliet, and sometimes the students remember, sometimes they don't. Remember at the beginning, do you bite your thumb at me, sir? Well, that's an emblem. Illustrators are meant to add or clarify verbal meaning. Examples include using your hands to count out things or show how big or small something is. As you can see in this picture, I was using my hands to illustrate a point to Lee Cunningham when we discussed some of my plans for this broadcast in Chicago last month. I was trying to say, no, Lee, I can't do that. Regulators are meant to control the flow of communication. Examples include pointing, waving your hand, showing the palm of your hand. In this picture of Barack Obama that we saw in a previous slideshow, it shows him holding up his hand as in a gesture that says stop or quiet or hold on a second. Adapters are habitual gestures in time of stress, such as rolling a pen or tapping your fingers. These can send a subtle message of anxiousness, and you really should try to minimize them. Appearance is another aspect of nonverbal communication. How we look and what we wear says a lot about who we are. First impressions are usually made by evaluating a person's appearance. Therefore, appearance is a form of nonverbal communication. It says something about who we are, what we believe, what is our social status, or what we think it should be, among other things. You've probably heard the saying, dress for the job that you want, not the job that you have. It is human nature to create attributions based on appearance. You can look this up in any intro to psych, social psych textbook. The use of distance and space also varies from culture to culture and is an important aspect of communication, nonverbal communication. The best examples illustrating these cultural differences always come from my students. I teach a class on occasion at the University of Miami in business communication and public speaking. I also teach here at Florida International University. But my class at the University of Miami is predominantly white, not from South Florida, and typically from the Northeast or Midwest. So I asked them, Has anyone here met someone from Miami, and when you go to shake the person's hand, they pull you in for a kiss on the cheek? The majority of the class laughs with embarrassment. They tend to agree. You don't get that close with somebody on the first meeting. Well, this is true according to, quote-unquote, Anglo culture. In Miami, however, with its strong Latin American flavor, it's very common for people to greet each other with a kiss on the cheek, even if meeting for the first time. The distance that we keep from each other and the use of our personal space, then, is dependent on cultural rules and norms. It's funny, when I teach the class at FIU, the opposite is true since we are a Hispanic serving institution. A lot of the students here say when they meet somebody who's not from Miami and the person kind of backs away, they kind of get a little offended. The physical environment can also reveal characteristics of the owner. The way furniture is arranged, the use of lighting, smell even. Right now I'm burning actually I'm not burning any candles, but I have a little incense thing here in the office that reminds me of what it's like to be up north. I know Gary wants to come down to Miami, but I don't know what it smells like in the winter, I guess, right? So the physical environment can produce an approach or avoid response. You've experienced this before if you've ever gone into an office and thought to yourself, whoa, get me out of here, or wow, this feels cozy. The use of time is also strongly culturally bound. What exactly does it mean to arrive on time? How long is in a minute, or as soon as possible? There are two ways cultures treat time, polychronic and monochronic. Polychronic cultures see time as fluid. One never means the time that one says. Things will eventually get done. Monochronic cultures see time as fixed, crystallized. One means exactly the time that one says. There's a deadline, and you better meet it. Again, the best examples come from my students. I had a student who is from Miami tell me once that whenever she has a party, she sends an invitation that will read 8 p.m. to one group of her friends, and to the other group, a different invitation that reads 9 p.m. in the hopes that they'll all show up right around the same time. Let's conclude this section on the science of communication with another quick polling question just to give us a feel for our colleagues who are viewing today's broadcast. Please choose the statement on the screen that best describes your situation. The first, I'm viewing the presentation as an individual, and I would say I have a polychronic orientation to time. I'm pretty fluid about schedules and deadlines. I'm viewing the presentation as an individual, and I would say my orientation to time is monochronic. I take deadlines and appointments very seriously. Our group has more individuals that see themselves as having a polychronic orientation. Our group has more individuals that see themselves as having a monochronic orientation. Or, well, let's see. Most of the group hasn't arrived yet, so I guess we must be polychronic, and I'm sure those are my people here in Florida. And we were all here and ready to go 10 minutes ago before the broadcast started. We are a highly monochronic group. Charlie, while we're waiting for our viewers to take their choices or to make their choices here, how would you describe your orientation to time? I know you're from the South, so...
Okay, and being from the South would mean what, Jose?
Well, you know, more polychronic, no?
I think it's really according to the situation. I think the situation I'm in makes me one or the other. I tend to be possibly much more monochronic with deadlines that other people have to meet for me than possibly monochronic with my own deadlines all the time, as Lee and Marcia can probably attest to. But I tend to think deadlines are pretty important, and I'm one of these people who really thinks being on time is something important as well. So if I had to choose one or the other, I may lean more to monochronic than polychronic. It's according to the day, possibly.
Well, that's interesting because I'm pretty similar. I've become much more monochronic over time. As well, the listeners may not know, but my parents are of Cuban descent. I was born in California, Los Angeles, but I grew up, in a Cuban household. So I've always had a pretty polychronic orientation. Most of my friends are very polychronic. But as I've matured and developed, I've definitely developed more of a monochronic approach over time. But I have been known to arrive, an hour or so late to a party before it's, quote, supposed to begin. But I think that I'm more monochronic when it comes to business affairs, and definitely more polychronic when it comes to personal things. Okay, I think we have some results in, and let's see, where are people at? All right, so 54% saying that as a group, and they are monochronic, no surprise there. 8% are saying polychronic. That's everyone who's listening from South Florida or Florida, I suppose, right? No, I'm kidding. And let's see here. 16% also said that they were highly monochronic. Okay, interesting mix. And it looks like we have a lot more people listening as a group, so wonderful. Okay. So now let's discuss, now that we've discussed the science of communication, let's take a look at how we can use it in our day-to-day sessions, right? When we're dealing with students and their myriad of issues. In 2007, my colleague Rosa Fuste from Broward College and I presented in Baltimore on how to build better rapport with students. Both of us had taken counseling courses as part of our respective master's programs and felt that having had these counseling classes really helped us in building better relationships with our students. I'd like to briefly review 3 key features that Rosa and I discussed, which help students in building rapport, or help to build rapport with students, excuse me. The first is active listening, reflection of meaning, and supportive confrontation. This is what I like to call the art of communication. Let's first look at the behavior of active listening. This means being engaged with the student when he or she is speaking. It is being attentive to the student's verbal and nonverbal messages. Active listening involves feedback, and this can be in terms of paraphrasing, summarizing, and checking for accuracy of the conversation. Paraphrasing is simply restating what the student has said. It can involve a sentence stem that helps the students to summarize and personalize what you've just said. Some examples of a sentence stem include, it seems like what you're saying is, it sounds like, when you say it, I hear you saying X. Sentence stems are meant to help clarify what the student has said. However, they should be used sparingly because you may sound redundant if you say it too often or too much. When paraphrasing, it is also good to use key words. That is, words that capture the main idea or encapsulate the student's problem. Lack of parental support, arguments, career confusion. Last is, it's good to use checkout statements. Now, these are brief questions asking for feedback about what was just said after having used a sentence stem or a key word. So, am I hearing you correctly? Is this close to what you said? Using checkout statements is a good way to make sure that you're not forcing your attributions or interpretations of what you've heard onto the student. It is very important that you do not pass judgment or sound as though you're passing judgment. These active listening behaviors are meant to ensure that what is being said is truly understood by the advisor and the student. In addition to ensuring that you have heard the student and understood what was said, you must also show some nonverbal attentiveness. This is the application of the nonverbal communication pieces that we just previously discussed. Try to use encouraging behaviors, including head nodding and vocalizations, an aha, a yes, okay. Now don't overdo it. Just do it when it feels right. Remember, we're now in the art of communication. Rosa's professor, Dr. Ana Maria Reyes, used an acronym that we found very helpful, SOLAR. It stands for squarely face the student, maintain an open posture, try to lean forward slightly, be sure to make eye contact, and keep an overall relaxed manner. These behaviors are meant to get the student to open up to you, to create a positive environment where the student will feel welcome. Carl Rogers wrote in his book, A Way of Being, quote, individuals have within themselves vast resources for self-understanding and for altering their self-concepts, basic attitudes, and self-directed behavior. These resources can be tapped if a definable climate of facilitative psychological attitudes can be provided. It's what he called his person-centered approach to therapy, and I would argue could be a student-centered approach to advising. You don't have to be a therapist to create an open and welcoming environment where a student is more willing to disclose. I've often said, advising can be therapeutic. However, it's not therapy. In addition to paraphrasing, reflection of meaning and feeling is needed to help in clarifying the needs of the student. Reflection of meaning is just that, trying to figure out what the student is really trying to say and then reflect it. It's almost as though we're putting up a mirror to the student to help him or her get a better idea of what he or she is expressing. Some techniques you can use to reflect meaning include the following questions. What does this mean to you? What was the lesson in that experience? What have you always wanted to do? Why? Who is influential in your life? The purpose of these questions is to get at what the student is really trying to say. In my experience advising students, I've often noticed how little insight, if any, they have into their own behaviors. Often, they are simply going through the motions of college and have never been asked or questioned, or a question, that hits a raw nerve. One that gets at the meaning of why they're doing what they're doing. Viktor Frankl, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, says that all humans have a will to meaning. That is, we all need to find and create meaning in our lives. The last piece of the art of communication is providing supportive confrontation. I believe it is our job as advisors to point out to students when they are contradicting themselves, when we feel they're giving us mixed messages, when they need to hear a little dose of reality. Now, to effectively confront a student's contradiction, you have to do so supportively. Some techniques include the following. Identifying the student's discrepancies or incongruencies. Now, this is not simply shouting it out, but rather just being careful to listen to the meta messages. What is he really trying to say? What's the message behind the message? Once you've identified the discrepancy or the contradiction, then you point it. So some things you can say include, on the one hand, you're saying this, but on the other hand, you've also said this. Am I hearing you correctly? You can challenge the students to question his or her own motives. Ask them why. This should all be descriptive and non-judgmental. You are just pointing out to the student what he or she said, all right? You're not passing any judgment. Once you've pointed out the issue, you'll want to evaluate. How did the student take it? Is the student exhibiting any kind of insight into his or her decision-making process? When challenging students, you have to be really mindful of your voice, tone, vocal intonation, body movements, eye contact, facial expressions, all these things that are called nonverbal communication. If it's not coordinated, if they're not in sync, the student may misinterpret what you've said. The student may interpret it as a challenge and as a personal attack. Lastly, you'll want to help the student reframe the issue. That is, you're going to want to try and help a student to see things from a different perspective. Oftentimes, when a student has come in for advising and I've had to tell them, you need to change your major, I don't usually say those words. I would say something such as, well, what other avenues are there towards graduation? And we try to help reframe achieving that goal. But now we're really hitting at the heart of the webinar. This is where the most significant conversations occur. This is where advising now becomes transformational. It helps students to transform the way they see themselves and their education. Helping students to reframe is at the heart of the NACADA motto. Advising is teaching. Transformation can occur when you're trying to help a student see things in a different light, whether it be the student's response to bad news or a simple misunderstanding of the curriculum. As we say in NACADA, advising is teaching. But what do we really mean by teaching? According to Paul Ramsden, author of Learning to Teach in Higher Education, he says that teaching is a process of working cooperatively with learners to help them change their understanding. He also says that learning is a change in one's conceptions, a change in one's understanding of something. Okay, so if advising is teaching, and teaching is meant to transform and change the way students think about and understand things, then advising must also be meant to transform and change the way students think and understand things. Let me say that again, just to be certain that everyone's with me on this. If advising is teaching, and teaching is meant to transform and change the way students think and understand things, then advising is also meant to transform and change the way students think and understand. Excuse me. All of the previous points of the science and art of communication lead up to this point. The advising session is meant to elicit change in our students. The way we communicate, the rapport we build, it's all meant to help students get to a place where they can better understand themselves and their education. Let me return to the issue of reframing because it plays such an important role in what I'm saying right now. In my presentation that Charlie mentioned, the Breaking Bad News to Students, I quoted the authors Miranda and Brody as saying that bad news is, quote, anything that changes the person's view of the future in a negative way. Now, the key words there are person's view. According to Rabot and McPhee, bad news often threatens a person's identity and challenges his or her sense of transpersonal meaning. In our line of work, I'm sure that we're breaking bad news all of the time. That moment when the bad news is broken transforms the way that the student sees things. The perception of him or herself and belief in his or her abilities and dreams, it's all shaken and in some cases crushed. There's almost a feeling of death. This is the moment when the advisor is critically needed, when the art and science of communication merge to help the advisor help the student understand the nature of what has happened. It is the advisor that must help the student to transform, that is, change her way of seeing and understanding, and help her or him find meaning again. Let me quote Viktor Frankl again. He has such great quotes, and if you haven't read his book, Man's Search for Meaning, it is truly an incredible read. Viktor Frankl, if you don't know, is a Holocaust survivor, or was, I should say, and also was a very famous psychiatrist. We must never forget that we may also find meaning in life, even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. For what then matters is to bear witness to the uniquely human potential at its best, which is to transform a personal tragedy into a triumph, to turn one's predicament into a human achievement. This is when we are truly advising, folks, when we are truly teaching. Transformation doesn't always have to come out of some sort of bad news or tragedy. It can happen in very mundane moments as well. The point is that if advising is truly teaching, then we must be willing to help students change their understanding of themselves and their education. Advisors are in an ideal spot to help students achieve that change and to live a fuller and richer college experience. Carl Rogers believed that everyone has the ability to change. The therapist just had to provide the environment to foster that change. Similarly, I really do think that students have the ability to change. We as advisors just have to now provide them with the environment to foster that change. Now, having said this, I also know from my many years in the trenches that students sometimes, I would actually say a lot of times, come into advising with only a marginal level of self-awareness, and that not all students are mentally ready for transformation. So to better illustrate my ideas, I've created some vignettes, and trust me, it took a lot of imagination, I'm sure, right, to develop these vignettes and their various levels of openness to transformation. So as I said, it does not have to be a negative situation for a student to be willing to change the way he or she sees things. However, more often than not, students will not question their motives until a negative situation presents itself. Therefore, I have 4 illustrative vignettes to share with you today that have a common theme. The student cannot get into the major because she has not been able to meet the criteria for admission to that major. Now, this is a pretty complicated nomenclature, folks, so try and follow along with me, okay? Easy, all right? This is the student who knows that she will have to change her major. She's aware of the requirements. She knows that she hasn't met them, but she's just in a light state of denial. She hasn't quite fully accepted her situation. She's hoping that maybe if she gets to talk to somebody, that she'll be able to get her way, though she's pretty aware that chances are slim. This student needs the advisor to have a frank discussion with her about the academic reality. It may begin with some active listening. Ask some questions about where is she at, what's she doing, where's she going, how are things going on. You probably don't need to beat around the bush too much with this type of student. You can try to use some direct supportive confrontation. So, on the one hand, you're telling me that you want to become a medical doctor, but on the other hand, you've also said that you're not doing very well in any of your science classes. Tell me, what do you know about getting into medical school? A question that taps into meaning will also be helpful here. So, why is it that you want to go to medical school? Tell me, why do you want to become a medical doctor? Is it just for the money? You're looking for the student, and we all know, right, advisors, it's not just for the money. You're looking for the student to give you a broader answer. You want to tap into the student's value system. In this case, many students have said to me when I've asked these questions after a lot of probing and reflection, I just want to help people. There it is. That is the value. That is the guiding principle. Now, we all know, is medicine the only profession that, quote, helps people? Of course not. If it were, we'd be in big trouble. This is the moment to point it out to the student in a gentle, non-judgmental, but yet direct way. This is the moment to discuss other options, other paths, other avenues to achieving that same goal. Here is where reframing occurs. All of this must take into account the science of communication, because if it's not done correctly, it can, and it has, backfired. I've experienced some situations where I did not take my own advice, and wow, did it backfire on me. Had one student accuse me, I remember, it made me feel so horrible. You haven't helped me at all. I mean, it was pretty bad, so you have to be very acutely aware of how you say things. Students at this level have more than a shallow understanding of their college education. They may be cognitively ready for transformation. She just needs some nudging from an advisor, some help. At this level, you'll probably encounter minimal resistance. This student typically knows that the jig is up. Okay, second part of our complicated nomenclature, the medium student. This is similar to the easy level, but the student is slightly more resistant to change. This student is marginally aware of his status, what the requirements are, and how he meets or doesn't the criteria for admission to your program. This student's level of denial is stronger than the previous level, but he's not yet completely blinded. Much like the previous student, he needs to be confronted with the academic reality. Maybe softly at first, but progressively harder. Again, one could begin by discussing the grander life goals rather than the immediate goals of, I want to be in a journalism school. The discussion can begin with, so what are your goals in life? If the student responds, to get my journalism degree, then you ask the student a question that gets at a deeper meaning or value. So, why do you want a journalism degree? The questions will get deeper and deeper, a lot like the Socratic method. The student may get frustrated because, as we've said, he is not at all aware of his inability to meet the criteria for admission. So here's the difficult task of getting the student to see his degree as more than just a piece of paper, and his major as more than just a means to an end. It may take a few advising sessions to get through to this type of student. You will have to assign him some homework, and I am a big believer in assigning homework in advising. All that can be taught or done will not happen in one advising session. I think we all know that. My favorite is to show students the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or the OOH. It's published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a branch of the Labor Department. In case you're wondering, their website is real simple, bls.gov. The OOH is a great tool to help students think more broadly and complexly about their career aspirations and their major choices. In this case, I would have the student look up journalist. We'd set up a meeting within the next couple of days or a week or so in which he is to report back what he found. Here is where the supportive confrontation comes in, along with the reframing. I would talk to him about how there are various ways of achieving his dreams, pointing out every so often the OOH and the research that he found. It's very important to show students that it's not just you saying something, but that you have some objective data or information that can help in getting the student to better understand. Students at this level tend to have a very shallow understanding of their college education. They may need more explanation of the purpose of college to help them see their role differently. Students at this level have some rigid cognitive tendencies. They may have a more set view of themselves and their career goals. In some cases, for these students, college is merely, as I've said, a means to an end. These are the tough ones who really need to change the way they see themselves. They need to be open to role variation. At this level, abundant resistance is encountered. This type of student typically needs more work. And it just gets more fun. The medium hard student, scenario 3. This type of student is similar to the medium, but this student, take a wild guess, has this illusion of change. You ever encountered that? I'm sure you have. Only to come back a week later with the same mentality. This is the student who exhibits all the resistance of that medium level just before. You work with her for a few advising sessions. You make some progress. She seems to get it as the conversation progresses. But at some point, she comes by your office and starts to backpedal on agreements and things that you discussed. This is the type of student who scrutinizes your nonverbal communication for any hint of tentativeness in what you're saying. This student will feign agreement, but she's looking for the contradiction in what you're saying. Remember, when the message codes of language, vocal, and visual are not in concordance, we will rely more on what we hear and see versus what was said. It's very important to document with this type of student because of the backpedaling. It's also important to keep in mind the importance of creating an open environment for discussion. This student will test your ability to keep your cool. Now, don't allow yourself to sound judgmental or patronizing, and I know this is the very difficult part. This will only further close the student off to change. I can't tell you how many times I've learned from my own mistakes. This student knows that she's in a tough situation, but she's trying to work the system to get her way. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us, you, the agent of change, to keep your cool, continue the active listening and supportive confrontation. This is the student who will need lots of confrontation. You may have to raise your voice, and you may have to get very stern. You should not, however, lose your cool or become judgmental, as much as we are just so wanting to sometimes. It is vital that you let the student know through your nonverbal channels as well that you're there and that you care and you're here to help the student grow. And lastly, and probably the best one of all, the one that we all love to have come by our office, the difficult student. This is the type of student who does not want to accept the academic reality of the situation. This student is in full-blown denial, and the blinders obscure any views of possible change. This type of student is severely out of touch with his academic performance and abilities. You can tell I've never seen someone like this. There is a major chasm between his ideal self and his real self. That is, he really sees himself as something completely different than what he really is. In some cases, these types of students think that they are performing much better than what any objective measure of data would suggest. This type of student will attempt to reverse the conversation and make you, the advisor, responsible for his failures. This type of student has no insight into his behaviors or the consequences of such behaviors. This type of student is completely resistant to any discussion of anything other than what he wants and in you making it happen for him. I also call him the Burger King student. You know, your way, right away, or actually his way. This person is obviously not at all open to transformation. Now, this person is difficult for a reason, folks, right? I mean, there may be other factors at play here that go well beyond the scope of advising, no matter how you may have. So it's important to be very vigilant of your communication with this type of student. Another bit of the science of communication that I didn't mention is this idea of self-monitoring. That is, people have various levels of how much they monitor what they say. This is a situation that would require a very high level of self-monitoring. You want to be very cognizant of what you say and how you say it, more so the how you say it. This type of student will put you to the test and put your will to the test. This student is not at all open to transformation. He wants it his way, and it's final. Now, admittedly, you will not always be able to get through to these types of students, and you know what? That's okay. I've had cases of difficult students who changed, who with time started to transform, who really started to make progress and see themselves in a different light. By the same token, I've had difficult students who would rather insult me than consider changing their current course of action. You know, I used to think and get, what's wrong? What did I do? Did I not help them enough? And I'd get upset with myself. But I've come to understand that, there are just some people who, no matter what you do, they don't want to change or consider changing. And you know what? It's okay. I know that I did my best in providing an open and welcoming environment to allow them to express themselves and hopefully see why their direction was headed in nowhere. And as long as you know that you're doing the best that you can, I think that's the best that we can hope for with some of these students. Now, at this point, I'm reminded of another quote by Viktor Frankl. He says that each person is questioned by life, and one can only answer to life by answering for your own life. To life, you can only respond by being responsible. And I think that right there is the key that may be missing with this difficult student. As we come to the end of our presentation time, let us quickly review some of the main points of our agenda today. We've discussed the art and science of communication. We looked at the specific aspects of communication and its complexity. We discussed the transactional model, the codes of meaning, paralanguage, and nonverbal communication. We also reviewed some basics in the art of communication, such as active listening, reflection of meaning and feelings, and supportive confrontation. Last, we discussed how advising can be transformational for our students. That is, how advisors are in an important position to help students in reframing their sense of self and their view of their education, students that is. Now, listen, folks, I don't claim to know it all. I mean, all that there is to know about communication or transformational advising. My father always says, all I know is that I know nothing. But I think he stole that from Socrates. But anyway, point is that I think that we can only get better at what we do with time. It's not easy to provide an open environment where authentic exchanges between the advisor and the student can occur. Some days are going to be better than others. Some students will be more resistant than others. What is important, however, is that we make that attempt. As I said earlier, if we really believe that advising is teaching, and that teaching, learning, or education is meant to change people, then we must accept that advising is transformational. It does involve having these significant conversations that can change the way a student sees himself and his education. Finally, let me leave you with a quote I think really captures the essence of this topic today. As you can see, I've quoted Viktor Frankl extensively. Again, I just felt his book was really hit at the heart of what I was trying to get across today. He says, quote, "Suffer to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice." This is our role, ladies and gentlemen, helping students find meaning in what they do. Thank you very much for allowing me to spend some time with you this afternoon. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have in the time that remains. I believe our executive producer, Lee Cunningham, and Lee, I'm officially giving you that title, is waiting to assist with question and answer segment, so I will mic it over to her right now.
Well, thank you for that promotion, Jose, and for your presentation. Let's turn to our questions and see how many of those that we can get to in the time we have remaining. Actually, Jose, I have a question that I'd like to ask. You and Charlie talked earlier about monochronic versus polychronic orientation, and I think you said that your household growing up was more on the polychronic side. Well, mine was definitely on the monochronic side, very much so. And one of the things that my father told me over and over and over again when I was a child was that time is valuable, time is money, you should never waste anybody's time, and that it's an insult to somebody to be be late for an appointment with them. And that was something I had very much drilled into me as a child. And even when I began to understand that there were different orientations, I still tended to have an emotional reaction that I had to work through every single time for quite a while when students would be late for an appointment. And I'm just wondering if there's something from the other end of the spectrum, if there's something that somebody comes from a polychronic orientation might find difficult to deal with when they're working with people from a monochronic orientation.
Well, absolutely, Lee. As you were saying that, I was thinking of an example. I mean, from the polychronic side, and essentially what it means is that there are just some cultures who, now as I said, you can change. I mean, I've definitely changed. I think Charlie had kind of alluded to that change as well, and it just takes time and maturity, I guess, to change our orientations. But polychronic just tends to see time as not necessarily fixed. So when you say, I mean, I have a very good friend of mine who, my God, whenever we go out, I have to tell her, look, I'm meeting you at an hour, before the hour that we're really meeting at, because if not, she'll never show up. And I think it's just that some people, as you say, they come from kind of like that background, the family that really instills that sense of you have to be here, do certain things. I mean, also with time, when somebody is late, it's almost as if they're saying, I don't care. At least to some folks, they may get that impression, oh, the person's late, I don't care. Like I tell my students, when you're going on a job interview, you obviously have to be, 10, 15 minutes before. You don't want to arrive 10 or 15 minutes after. But I also, when I teach this lecture to my class about polychronic and monochronic, we do talk about just being sensitive to different people's understanding of time. So it's not necessarily that you need to change, Lee, your time or anybody else does, but that we need to be sensitive and understand how other people view time, and maybe we need to educate some folks. I mean, I know that there's been some students who I've seen in advising in my time here at FIU. We have a lot of students, I don't know the exact number offhand, but we have a lot of students that do come from Latin America, and there's a different way kind of doing things. And some of the students, I remember when I first started working here, I had to, a couple of my students would say, hey, look, you have to make sure that if you're not going to make it, you can't just not show up, or if you're going to be late, you have to, call us, let us know. You can't come to a 30-minute advising appointment, 20 after and expect to get a full-fledged advising appointment. So it also requires just some, some teaching and some getting accustomed to it. But I think that it's something that we can hopefully not have too much of a visceral reaction to. But I do understand where you come from with that.
One of our questioners today would like to know what are some techniques that you use for helping to calm down a student who arrives at your office angry.
Oh. I don't know. None of my students are ever angry at me, Lee. Come on. Yeah, well, I'm trying to remember now. Gosh, that's a really good question. It's tough, I mean, I remember when I first started, I said, oh my, sometimes there's an immediate reaction of, you want to, for example, if the student comes in crying, that you want to get the student to stop crying. And what I have found is that, sometimes you just kind of have to let them express and try and say, hey, so what's going on? How are things? You seem really upset. What's the deal? Just listen to them. A lot of times they just want somebody to listen. They just want somebody who they can go to and vent for a little bit. Maybe you did something, made a mistake in the advising, or maybe somebody else made a mistake. I know a problem that most students have around, I think, any university. We're a big, Florida International University is a very large university, metropolitan. We have over 38,000 students. So, sometimes students can get bounced around a little bit. They may go to the registrar, then they may go to cashiers, then they may go to advising, then they go, and so they just, they're so annoyed at getting tossed around that just want somebody who they can vent to. And oftentimes when students come in angry, what I'll try and do is, definitely my self-monitoring goes up. I try to say, okay, wait a minute, how am I looking? How am I sounding? I try to be more cognizant of it. And I try to let them vent. I try to, again, create that open environment, ask them some questions about how's it going, what happened, oh man, that sounds horrible. Yeah, you try and be there with them. You don't want to be their enemy. Or part of the problem. You hopefully want to try and be a solution. And once they kind of vent, I think that they start to let go of that anger a little bit, and then They calm down. I've had some students who just walked out after they saw me, so sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. But I think that the point is that you try to make an environment that is welcoming, and you really try to be on their side and try to let them vent and, just let them express their anger. I think it's always a bad thing. We want to so quickly. It's hard for us sometimes to deal with emotion, and we want them to stop being emotional. But that's sometimes shouldn't be the case. You should go ahead and let them just, express it a little bit.
Another one of our viewers has asked, Jose, do you think that the level of resistance that a student exhibits to change, example, that difficult student, is that partly or maybe wholly a developmental issue, or are there other things involved?
That's a very good point. I mean, this is only an hour webinar. I mean, we can definitely go on for another hour about the developmental aspects of everything that we just discussed, but I was trying to keep it focused. But absolutely, there are developmental issues at all of those 4 vignettes and kind of stages. And by the way, I just kind of made, each of those stages up, but I think our students kind of seem to fit into those. The difficult student definitely has got some issues developmentally across various aspects of them, and it varies from student to student. I mean, one student who I thought of in particular when I was putting this together was one who just didn't really have any insight. I mean, I tried every piece of arsenal in my repertoire of communication skills, and nothing was getting through to him. And I think that there was just some aspects, developmentally speaking, where he was maybe kind of stuck. And as I've said, I mean, advising is not therapy, but it can be therapeutic. And if some students, come out of the advising session having dealt with other issues, great. But I have a feeling with these difficult students, yes, there are definitely some developmental things that sometimes go beyond the scope of advising. And I think that's where it's important for when do we need to refer somebody. And when do we have to go to a higher power? When do we have to say, look, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I need to send you to the director or the assistant dean or to whomever. When in doubt, pass it on.
Well, well, you'll be happy to know that
kidding.
Some of our responders here are actually using your techniques. One of them would like some clarification on what exactly do you mean when you use the term transpersonal meaning?
Okay. Well, that's not my term. That was, let me actually look just quick here at the notes. That was an article that I had quoted when I did the presentation on breaking bad news to students. So transpersonal meaning, essentially, that's a good question. How do we make sense of ourselves, right? How do we view ourselves in terms of what does it mean to go to college? What does it mean to be a psychology major? What does it mean to be a pre-med major? What does it mean to do any of these things? And when we encounter bad news, when something that is not going our way or is very clearly going to alter the way we thought we were going, it changes our identity. It threatens our sense of self. Transpersonal meaning, I think, is just a more fancy term for your sense of self, of who you are, of how you see yourself. That particular quote was actually taken from medical journals. When I did the research for breaking bad news to students, the majority of the research I found had to do with breaking bad news in a medical field in terms of breaking bad news, people who have cancer or terminal illnesses and those kinds of things. So what were doctors kind of researching in that aspect? And I thought, I don't know about you all out there, but I can't tell you how many students who I've had to break bad news to who just reacted in a way as if I said, you're going to die tomorrow. I mean, it was very visceral. It altered their sense of self and who they are. So transpersonal meaning really means, who do you are and how do you make sense of who you are and what you're doing. And when we encounter bad news, it really puts into question that sense of self.
You mentioned, yeah, I think it did. And you mentioned a couple of different times that the recognition that we're not therapists, we are advisors, and one of the realities for most of us in the difference between a therapist and an advisor is very often a time issue. Quite frankly, most of us can't afford to spend the amount of time with our students that a therapist might be able to spend. So what thoughts do you have or suggestions about just dealing with that fact that we have very limited time sometimes to try to make this progress happen.
It's one of the most difficult things, I think, about being an advisor. It's also one of the most exciting things. I think that's why hopefully we continue doing what we're doing, because it's challenging and it's also exciting. When I worked in the College of Business here at FIU, at Florida International, I remember, the College of Business here has over 8,000 students, and I think at the time we were maybe 5 or 6 advisors. So you do the math and figure out how many student per advisor. It was just cranking them out. Lots of them. And what I tried to figure out or find is, not everyone is necessarily going to have a transformational conversation. Not everyone's going to have a significant conversation. Definitely, it's going to be more difficult to do this when you're at peak registration and the students are just, there's a mile down the road waiting to get in to see you. So I would definitely say that's probably not the time to be having this kind of conversation. But making the time with students, especially those who we feel, need it, those who just, I think it is our job to help them better understand their education and who they are. To me, that's the whole point of advising. I don't think it's just telling the kid what to take. And I think most people would agree, about that, especially anybody who's part of NACADA would agree with that. And it is difficult. I used to find time. I would just block out certain appointment schedules and say, okay, there's a student coming in who I know has a lot of issues and is not understanding the requirements, and I really need to spend some time with this person. As I moved on and became an advising administrator, I was director of student services in the School of Journalism. Yes, I was afforded some more time to do that because my primary role was no longer advising, as well as now as an assistant dean in the Honors College. But I think that it's incumbent upon us to try and make the time to see and pick the students who we want to see and say, look, it's almost like intrusive advising to a certain degree. I really need to talk to you, but definitely know when you should be doing it. There's certain times in the year that it's probably just not a good idea to try and have that long conversation with the student.
Another one of our viewers would like to know if there's any difference in techniques that you would use when you're dealing with a student. They're not in denial about their situation. They're just obviously not working up to their potential. You can see that they could be doing considerably more than they are. Is there a difference in ways to encourage them?
Yes, and that's a good question. You're right. Not all students are going to be in full-fledged denial. Some students are. But those students who are not. I usually like to just say it. Just come right out and say it. And I said to students, I know you can do better than this. I know. Show me that you can do better than this because I know you have so much more potential. I think that we need to not be afraid to be direct with our students. Now, again, it's not being judgmental. It's not sounding judgmental. It's not sounding like mom or dad, okay? Because I think that sometimes some advisors can come off as if they're the student's a parent, and we definitely don't want that. But because then the students can react as if the advisor is the parent. And then you get into this whole Freudian thing, and it gets kind of complicated. But anyway, the point is that I think that it's important for us to be direct with our students. And if you really think somebody has potential, and that student isn't working to his or her fullest potential, I say, you know what? Tell the student. How do you tell a student? They come in to see you. You're talking. I've had it this many times. Pedro, I'm looking at your stuff, man, and it just seems to me like you really can do more. Obviously, when we have our conversations, you really know what you're talking about. You seem very interested and directed or whatnot, but there's something that's going on here in the classroom or when you're doing your work that's not reflecting what I'm seeing here. What do you think it is? And maybe you challenge them and you get them to start thinking, oh, wow, yeah, maybe I am not working to my fullest potential. Or if they believe at least that somebody's out there rooting for them, somebody's out there who says, yeah, I really do think you can do better than this. In my class, when I teach business communication and public speaking, I usually put my standards very, very, very high the first day because I want the students to work to their fullest. I want them to know, look, if you want to do well in this class, you better need to be doing very well as well. And I think that it's important for us to definitely be direct with those students, and not beat around the bush.
Okay, a practical question from our next viewer is, you talked about the need to document conversations, particularly with the more difficult students. Could you give some more detail on exactly what you mean by document? What kind of style of documentation would you use? How heavily would you write or not write, or what what would you do to actually do the documentation?
Tape record. No. With one student who I had to have either somebody else in the room or a tape recorder. But by documentation, it can be as simple as taking some notes in the student's file, whether you have an electronic file or a paper file. I sometimes write a memo right after the student has left my office that says, a memo to the file. That just basically delineates, what did we talk about? What did I say you need to do? What are my impressions of the student? I'll go back to that one kid, or student, I should say, who, he really just tested me. He put my will to the test. We had a series of conversations. The first couple conversations we had, I didn't document because I just didn't feel the need to have to. And then after the third conversation, I said, wow, you know what? I better be documenting this, because he came back saying, oh, no, you told me to do something else. And I said, wait a minute. I know what I told you, and that's not something that I would say. So after he left, rather than doing it while he was there because I thought that would be rude, I waited until he left, and then I just tried to get an idea, a sketch in a memo document, what it is that we discussed and what it is that I said for him to do. Eventually, it got to the point with this particular student, he just did not want to listen to what I said, that I documented it in front of him, and I had him sign what it is that we discussed, because he was just always claiming that I was saying something different. So it is important to take some sort of notes, but I don't think you should do it while you're talking to the student. You don't want to detract from the nonverbal attentiveness. You don't want to detract from the active listening. You want to be there with the student in the moment, and you want to create and keep that open environment, that student-centered approach, as I've said.
Okay, this next question, I'm not sure how thoroughly we'll be able to answer it, because it's hard to know exactly what the questioner is asking, but they're saying they have a comment that there seems to be a lot of coaching that is involved in this model. I'm not sure exactly what they mean by coaching. I know that there's a group out there in advising that's calling that a new model of advising, so I'm not sure whether they're referring to that or just, regular everyday kind of coaching. But take that word, coaching, and would you feel that applies in any way to what you're talking about?
Well, it's interesting. I think so. I think that a lot of, all these different, I'm not proposing a new theory of advising, by the way. I'm just saying that I think advising has a very key role and function in students' lives and in higher education, primarily that of transformation, helping students to really get a better grasp of who they are, of what they want, and what this thing that we call higher education is all about. If it's coaching, then great. If it's not, I'm not sure what else to really call it. I'm not too familiar myself either, Lee, with the coaching side. I know that it's an up-and-coming area here in NACADA. A lot of people are interested in advising as coaching, and I definitely think that this could be a part of that, that coaching has its place and that maybe this is much like coaching. What I think, at least the point I've tried to make, is one that we need to help students in understand what it means to be a college student, understand what it means to go to college and have a higher education, and how their major or their career and how all these things fit into it. In that aspect, I think that's our role. If that's coaching, then so be it.
Okay, and we've got, I think, time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. But the next one is another one that we could do a whole webinar on, but I'll throw it out to you and let you see what you want to say about it briefly. That situation that we have all encountered where we've got a student and their parents are pressuring them to go in a particular direction that it obviously is not a direction that their strengths are in, and the student is struggling because they really want to please the parents. Any thoughts about that kind of a situation?
Again, I've never seen this before. I'll give you an example. When I was advising at the University of Miami, I was in the Department of Psychology, and I used to have a lot of pre-med advising there, or do a lot of pre-med advising, because, a lot of our students didn't want to do bio, they did, psychology. I had one student who, my gosh, the poor girl took, I think, chemistry like 5 times, and I'm not kidding, like literally 5 times. Couldn't pass it. I think the 5th time finally was getting a C or something like that. Physics 3 or 4 times, math, who knows. And she came into advising one day, and I said, this is a problem. I started to point things out to her. I think back at that time I was, maybe not as careful in what I said, or maybe she just misinterpreted what I said, because I thought she was fine. She ran out the door crying. Later I come to find. Her mother calls me about an hour later, telling me, how dare I tell her daughter that she's not going to medical school and blah, blah, blah. So what I had to do is, all within the confines of FERPA, help her mother understand, well, wait a minute, what is it exactly that your daughter is trying to achieve here, and what exactly does she need to do to achieve these goals? And I remember we spent almost an hour on the phone. I remember I had to get up and walk outside for a breath of fresh air because it took a while. But helping the mother understand the students' achievements, abilities, and whatnot, and just kind of aligning these ideas of, okay, this is what she wants to be, but this is the reality, and that there are ways of helping people. I'm not saying that she can't go to medical school. It's tough. I definitely try to focus on helping the parent understand. I had somebody not too long ago when I worked in the School of Journalism come in with her mom, and I think it was interesting. The mother had a pretty set idea of what she wanted the daughter to do, and I tried not. Some people will say, well, focus on the student, don't focus on the parent. But what I try to do is I try to do a healthy balance of the two. I try to make the comments directed at the students, but also, maybe look at the parent so that the parent feels at least that they're a part of the conversation. I think that we don't have to, carve the parent out of this relationship, but maybe we have to kind of help them balance their role a little bit, or at least try to help them to understand to balance their role. It's always a tough one. Whenever you see a parent walking around the corner, you want to go run under your desk, I'm sure. At least I do, even now. But it's, you have to try and bring the parent in on the conversation without letting them dominate it, obviously, and take over. I had one student, it was really funny. Well, not funny, haha, I suppose, but funny, interesting. I think the student was from Thailand, and he was going through a lot of problems, physical issues. He actually had a pretty serious physical ailment and didn't really want to, accept it, and kept dropping classes and, messing up in school. And then one day he comes into the office for advising, and he comes with his mother, his brother, his sister, his uncle, and a cousin, and I forget who else. And, so the whole family's in my office going, what's going on with him? He needs to change, and he needs to do something else, and he needs, so I remember my first reaction was, okay, let me acknowledge everybody's presence. Let me acknowledge the authority of maybe the uncle or the mother or whomever was there. And then let me focus on the student as well, and make sure that he understands how I'm here to help and what we can do to help him through the tough time. And I just remember it was like, wow, it was one of those moments where it was almost surreal just to have so many people in your office. But again, I tried to connect with the family and make them feel part of the process.
Okay, as our time is running out, before we have to close up here, I just want to send some kudos out to our good friends at Berkeley who've been so supportive of these events, who noticed the spelling error on one of our slides. The advising session is meant to elicit change. They are absolutely correct. We meant elicit with an E, not elicit with an I. So thanks for noticing that. And if you're keeping your handouts today, you might want to put an E there instead of an I, folks. And so
I meant I, Lee. I actually meant to say I, elicit. Yeah. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah. Okay. I'll unlock now.
So. Okay. All right. So we need to sign off now. We've lost Charlie's connection, so I will close up for us today. And for Charlie, I will say thanks, Jose, for sharing your expertise with us. You've done a tremendous job of gathering and organizing all of this material for the broadcast, and we tremendously appreciate your willingness to share your experience and your insights with us. So, Jose, on behalf of Charlie and the association, thank you for all that you've done today. And again, we want to thank all of our participants for being with us. We look forward to interacting with you in many future events.